Clough House has been standing for over 300 years, and its story, as you'll soon see, is a microcosm of the story of Boston's North End and of a certain slice of the American story. This webinar comes at the end of a month of programming that focused on archaeology, a fascinating topic in and of itself, but also an interesting way to hold past and present together and see how the world we live in coexists with elements of the past and has been shaped by it. We see that the choice to be thoughtful historians is an aspect of active citizenship, which is something that is a core value at Old North. Next month, our programming will take a look at how our proximity to the sea has shaped past and present. From colonial sea captains to efforts to save endangered marine life and habitats, there is plenty to look forward to. So please do keep an eye out for our newsletter and updates, because we would love to have you join us again. And now let me introduce my colleague, the other co-director of education, Erin Wedderbrook-Yuskaitis. Erin develops and produces our public programming and exhibits. Her creative, fun approach, which is rooted in scholarship, has had an enormous impact on Old North and its visitors in the 8 years she has been a member of the education team. So Erin, here we go.
Thank you, Catherine. It is a treat to be introduced. I'm usually the one doing the introducing for all of our programs, and it's really fun to be on the speaking end. The Clough House has been a labor of love, and I will be telling you more about it tonight. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And before I do, I just want to introduce TJ Todd, the other member of our education team. He is our education manager, and he will be helping me tonight, fielding questions and monitoring the chat and the waiting room, etc. So if you hear somebody interjecting or asking me a question, it's TJ, and I've specifically asked him to help me keep things running smoothly so that I can focus on the presentation itself. All right, so I'm going to start sharing my screen and let's begin. Okay, so Catherine already introduced me. Still Standing, the Story of the Clough House is the name of our webinar. I want to tell you about what we'll cover tonight. We'll be going over 4 parts. We'll talk about the building and the structure itself, the changing iterations, the physical changes of the building. We'll be talking about the people, and we'll be specifically looking at 2 families who called 21 Unity Street home. We'll also be talking about the neighborhood, and specifically the North End community, and what the Clough House tells us about the North End. And finally, we'll talk about the preservation, the restoration of the structure itself, and the importance of saving old buildings. But throughout the webinar, I'll also be weaving in pieces of Still Standing, 300 Years of the Clough House at Old North, and sharing about the production of the exhibition, which actually was up in the Clough House for 4 months last year. So I wouldn't be a museum educator if I didn't have learning outcomes for the program. I wanted to share them with you all because I want you to help hold me accountable. What I'm aiming for you to get out of this experience is to discover the changing iterations in the history of the Clough House. There's a learn aspect. I want you to experience a greater connection to the people of the North End and the Clough House, and also to your own neighborhoods. And then I want you to comprehend the importance of historic preservation and becoming involved in saving old places. So we like to set up all of our programs with learning outcomes that have a learn, feel, act component to them, so that you're not just absorbing information, you're also keeping in touch with your emotions about history and about certain situations, and then hopefully motivated to act, because our whole focus at Old North is active citizenship. Okay, so let's start with the home. The Clough House, it's a historic home that was built on pasture land around 1711 by Ebenezer Clough, who was the master brick mason for Old North Church. So before he began work on the church in 1723, he built his house for his family and 5 other houses like it on Unity Street. The Clough House is actually one of only 3 remaining brick structures that date to the first decades of the 1700s in Boston. And it's the 6th oldest building in the city of Boston, older than even Old North, obviously. So in this image right now, we're seeing a rendering of the original 2-story home on the right. And on the left, we're seeing what it looks like today. These images are pulled from Joe Bagley's report from his 2013 excavation behind the Clough House. Joe Bagley is the City of Boston's archaeologist, and he actually gave us a lecture as part of our digital speaker series last week. And much of our knowledge about the Clough House today results from 2 particular reports. The one from 2013 from Joe's dig, and the other one is from a Historic American Buildings Survey, or HABS. I will probably refer to it as HABS throughout the rest of the webinar because that's a mouthful. Historic American Buildings Survey. And that was conducted by the National Park Service in about 1959 and 1960. So I just want to show you some quick pictures before the 2013 dig, and we're going to have a little bit of orientation after that. So right now we're looking at the back of the Clough House, and before the dig, the back entrance was actually walled off from the rest of the campus. So there would have been no way to access that brick wall that you're seeing next to the iron gate. That's how we access the Clough House from inside the campus now. So that was actually removed before the dig. And you can see here, Joe and his team are hard at work, and you see some of the items that they found. Now, obviously, I'll be going into more detail about that, but I just wanted to show you where they were actually digging as we move into orientation of the campus. So obviously, talking about what we're looking at and where we are would be helpful right now. So as many of you probably already know, Old North is located on the Freedom Trail, which comes through the Paul Revere Mall here, if you follow my cursor, and goes into the Bigelow Courtyard. Our gates are right here. Unity Street is a tiny little street that you have to cross in order to get to Old North, and that's where the Clough House is situated. There's many other parts of our campus, and we use the word campus because there are multiple buildings, multiple courtyards, multiple gardens. And the interesting thing about the Clough House, among many things that you'll learn tonight, is that it was originally constructed as an elegant single-family home for Ebenezer's family, but this building has served many purposes over time, which we'll dive into. It's been a single-family home, a multi-family home, a tenement, a house museum, and now it serves multiple purposes for Old North. There we go. So today, it serves a variety of purposes, as I mentioned, which exhibit space, interpretation space, offices, storage, you name it, we use it. And what I like to say about the Clough House is that the house has witnessed all of the changes in its surrounding neighborhood over the past 300 years, while it too changed to meet the needs of the community. So what we're looking at now is a rendering that I found in our archives, and I apologize for the poor quality of the picture. You can kind of see my shadow that I just took it with my iPhone while I was in our archives at Mass Historical Society. And what we're looking at is the Clough House in the center of the image. If you look at the bottom, again, where my cursor is, you can see the labels for each of the buildings. So directly next to the Clough House was a home that Benjamin Franklin's sisters lived in. It's most notably where Jane Franklin Meekum lived. And the thing that sticks out to me the most about this image is the shared wall. Because that's not what we see today. And it's hard to remember that it was not designed to be a standalone home, but it was actually part of some row houses. And that's what immediately jumps out to me. But what I want to do is to look closely at this image while we go back to the beginning of the story. So Ebenezer Clough not only built the 6 homes, as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, but he actually created Unity Street on a parcel of land called Bennett's Pasture. There was nothing around the area at the time, but Ebenezer knew that the neighborhood was growing. And another interesting fact here is that his house looked so much like the other houses he built. He didn't build a grand, unique home for himself, although compared to later uses, it was certainly grand. He built one that was practical and in keeping with someone of his status and his social class as a Mason. He did, however, use some interesting architectural details, which we'll cover later during the restoration. The thing to keep in mind is that even this rendering isn't accurate to how it looked during Ebenezer's time, because you can see at the bottom of this rendering, it's saying late 18th century. But thankfully, we have Joe Bagley. You'll hear a lot about him throughout this webinar. So for his forthcoming book, Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them, Joe created this overlay image where you're seeing what the original structure actually looked like, with faded behind that is the addition of the third floor that was added later. I'm going to switch back and forth between this image and the previous one so that we can compare and contrast. And I'm going to challenge you here because I specifically did not put them side by side on the same slide because I wanted to test your memory and your observation skills. So the question here is, what has changed by the end of the 18th century compared to what Ebenezer built? So I actually do want your comments. This is a small group of people tonight compared to a lecture. So you can either write in the chat or raise your hand, and TJ will see that by your name in the participants list, and we can unmute you. Chat might be easiest and quickest. So the question is, what has changed by the end of the 18th century compared to what Ebenezer built? So let me go back and forth just a minute. So what has been altered about Ebenezer's original design by the end of the 18th century? Okay, we're seeing, I'm seeing comments from people, addition of the third floor. We're seeing that's the evidence of that is the dormers that were added to the roof. The roof line has changed. The gables, I think, is what somebody's referring to, the dormers. Really, we're seeing a lot of the change on that top floor there. It was probably an attic and then was made into more livable space by the end of the 18th century. Someone also noticed the roof above the door. That was added later. Then another obvious one is that the attachment to the building next door. The important thing to keep in mind is that we don't have obviously we don't have a picture of that today because the building that was right next door that shared a wall was demolished in 1937. So the image that Joe created does not have that shared wall space that you would have seen. Later, we'll see an image where evidence of the Jane Franklin house exists, actually. So now let's take a look at the changing floor plan from the 1959 Habs report. So what you're looking at is actually what the Clough house looked like when it was restored. So when they were looking at this building that had gone through 300 years, almost 300 years of hard use. And when Ebenezer designed it, it was actually like this. So I just put these little rectangles here to block out the rear L that was added on. He actually designed it in this shape here. So it is kind of an L, the letter L shape versus the rear L, ELL. And we're seeing three basic rooms on the first floor. This is the first floor here. And this is the second floor. So the pattern on the second floor is very similar to the first. The rear L, not the letter L, but the addition L, was added around 1874, we believe. Even the the Habs report actually has a question mark on 1874. Um, Another thing to keep in mind is that by 1809, the first floor north side, so this space right here, became a butcher shop, starting a long history of businesses being in this location. And when the church took over, there was a business in that location as well. So one thing I want to draw your attention to is the old kitchen right here. I, like many people, always notice that in social gatherings at people's homes, everyone always seems to gather in the kitchen. It's probably because that's where the food and beverage is, but people often say that the kitchen is the heart of the home. And you know, obviously things were a bit different than in the way that people were living their lives. They wouldn't have necessarily invited people into the kitchen, but the hearth was such an important part of the home. And the one that Ebenezer designed was really magnificent. And the photo that I'm going to show you next is the restored hearth. So obviously, this is a hearth that has gone through many transformations. To me, this piece of the house helps me imagine Ebenezer's wife, Thankful Clough. I can imagine her baking bread. You see these two upside ovens over here. I can see her making a stew, all while trying to make sure that her petticoats are not catching on fire. And also, the picture of this hearth traces every evolution of the house with the changing, aging, and newer bricks that you're looking at. To me, it's almost like the dendrochronology of a tree, but for a brick mason. Even back then, the kitchen was the heart of the home, full of food and activity and the hustle and bustle of the day. So one of the things that we wanted people to think about with the still standing exhibit that actually took place in the Clough House is the types of housing. We're always, with our programs and exhibitions, wanting the visitors to make connections between the historic topic and their contemporary lives. And so when creating the exhibit, we wanted visitors to make the connection between the changing iterations of the Clough House and the type of home that they live in today. We also wanted them to find a way to connect to other visitors. So we included an interactive poll in the exhibit, and we want to issue that poll right now. So please participate. Tell us, what type of housing do you live in? If you haven't been able to participate, go ahead and do that quickly. Otherwise, we're going to close it. All right, TJ, I think we can end the poll. Okay, so you can see the results here. The majority, 58% of you, live in a single family home. And the next highest, or the actually equal, is multifamily home or a condo co-op, which is not unusual for Boston for where we lived. It's interesting that nobody in this webinar categorizes their home as an other. I'm sure you may be curious to see the results from the actual exhibit. So we'll stop sharing these poll results and show you the results from the exhibit. So we actually have this large wall size chart on the wall, and visitors were invited to take a sticker and place it in the category that best describes their home. And this was over the course of 4 months. So you can see that the majority of our visitors live in single family homes as well. And that interestingly, the next highest is an apartment. We were pleasantly surprised with how many people participated. It was really a source of excitement for a lot of people when they walked in. And we were also pleasantly surprised with the number of people who categorize their home as other, and a few people would actually even write on the tiny little sticker what it was so that we would know. So a few people wrote dorm, and there is a set of a few together, which I can't tell where it is on the wall right now, where they wrote boat. So it was a family that lived on a houseboat. Anyway, I wanted to share that with you, and you may also be wondering what the color coding is. So we asked the visitors to pick a sticker based on their age. So we're actually getting some informal data from our visitors when they participate in this exhibit activity. So if we go back, you can see that we're in single family home, we're seeing a lot of pink and green and orange. And when you look at the age range, you know that they are families living in a single family home. And as people move up in age, the type of housing tends to change. So that's why we're also seeing a lot in this 18 to 30-year-old group that is in apartments. So that data, let me go back. So that data is obviously not scientific, because I saw myself, like a child would just pick the sticker color that they liked and place it on the wall. We tried to be pretty diligent about making sure that people who put stickers on the wall were actually just marking it once for themselves. So there's no way of knowing how accurate this is, but it was an interesting way and a very easy way for people to participate and give a moment's thought to the type of home that they live in compared to the types of home other visitors live in, and then also the different types of homes that the Clough House itself has been. So now let's learn a little bit more about who lived here. After the death of Ebenezer Clough in 1724, the house changed owners several times. Each of the owner occupants were upper middle class and English descent. And in 1808, a third floor was added. So we were seeing the dormers, but they made it a full third floor. And the house was then divided into multiple increasingly crowded rental units, and gradually it became a tenement. So between 1810 and 1917, 180 different middle to working class families called the Clough House home, most living there for only a year or two at a time. And at the height of the tenement period over here in 1920, 29 different people lived in this one structure simultaneously. So this is a graph that Joe Bagley and his team created after the 2013 dig. And you can see the relative stability. Now they only started measuring in 1780. That's based on a lot of different factors. We'll go over the owners in just a minute. But we're seeing stability through about 1810, 1820. And you see a big spike when the third floor was added and the rooms started being rented out. And then we're looking at the tenement period really from about 1870 to 1920. If you haven't been in the house, it's really staggering to be in the space and imagine 29 different people living in that structure, especially when over here, you know, that's 8 families. So let's take a look at the owners. Again, this is a helpful graph created by Joe Bagley and his team. What we're seeing here is the families of upper standing, that, you know, they were doing pretty well. Some were merchants of English descent, and they were owning and occupying. Now, even Ebenezer wasn't quite, we think that he wasn't necessarily living in the house right before 1724, so he may have been living somewhere else, but members of his family were living there, and that seems to be the case all the way until we get to this period where tenants started living there, but the owners did not live there. Until 1870, the people who lived in this building had English or Canadian roots, once we're getting past the period where they were all of English descent. Then Irish immigrants moved in, although about a decade after Irish immigrants moved into other tenements in the North End, and followed by Italian immigrants about a decade later after that. And although this influx created the most ethnically diverse period of the Clough House, it actually differed greatly from most other North End tenements because African Americans, Jewish immigrants, and Portuguese immigrants did not live in the Clough House. Joe and his team, they have found no evidence of that in records or the artifacts they found in the dig. So by the early 1900s, though, only Italians and Italian Americans occupied this home, corresponding with a massive wave of Italian immigration to the US. So I want to talk about the types of jobs that we know people who lived at the Clough House had based on the archaeological record. So based on the 2013 dig conducted right behind the Clough House, so you saw it was really in the rear area where people would have thrown out their trash. It wasn't really a garden area. It's really like a trash area that was not well drained. Joe and his team found 36,465 artifacts representing the entire occupation period of the house. So these objects, some were only partial fragments, of course, demonstrate the variety of jobs, ethnic backgrounds, and home lives of the occupants. And I want to take a look at some of these based on what they found through poll tax records as well. So moving into, hold on. So in the 19th century, we're seeing, there was two categories. We're seeing people in the shipping industry in the variety of jobs that are listed on the screen, and we're also seeing artisans with a variety of jobs that are listed there. So not only was Joe seeing that in the poll tax records, but he was seeing that in a lot of the artifacts that he found. He found a lot of evidence for these jobs, particularly the artisan trades. And when you move into the 20th century, the jobs change according to the types of people who started living in the addition on the back of the Clough House. And he also found evidence of these, not just in poll tax records, but also in the artifacts. So when you move into the 20th century, he found evidence of construction positions. People who lived at the Clough House were laborers, glaziers, carpenters, painters, and plasterers, many of whom may have actually worked on the restoration of Old North Church from 1912. But they also found a lot of evidence from the service industries, so people working in the types of jobs that you see listed on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, lest you think I've forgotten to mention women and children, because they did work. According to Stephen Puleo, many second-generation women, most first-generation women did not work outside the home, but many second-generation women actually found work in the needle trades, would take that on in addition to running the home. And children found work as well, would often skip school because they were expected to contribute. And the types of jobs that he listed were being a delivery boy, a boot black, or I put driving, I should have specified wagon driving. So everybody in these homes were working very hard in crowded conditions. Sorry, having issues with my cursor. So what I think is simultaneously incredible and moving is that the archaeological record reveals the more everyday personal side of tenement life, recreating the stories of two groups often absent from the historical record, which is women and children. So going back to this idea of the people who probably spent more of their time in the home if they were not working. A large amount of children's toys and female-related artifacts, such as what you're seeing here. They found a fully intact lipstick tube with lipstick still in the tube. They found a pie crust mold, and also what you're seeing on the bottom right is a hood milk bottle. They also found marbles and doll parts and things like that. And to Joe, and to me as well, it paints a rather touching picture. And he writes, women gardening, children playing, letters to write, pies in the oven, families doing what they could to get by and lead a normal life. So the dig has really helped us more fully understand what the actual experience was like living in the Clough House through time. And while there isn't time for me to go into a deep dive into each family who lived here, because if we go back to that bar graph, there are way too many people to cover. And honestly, not enough research has actually been conducted on these people. I do want to take a look at two families who lived here during the tenement period to give us a better appreciation of the experience. Despite the hardships that these families were facing, living in tenements, they led rich and varied lives. It almost goes without saying, but I still want to say it. So I'm going to spotlight the McLaughlin family. And I'm actually going to read to you excerpts um, from Joe's report, because he writes about Joe is an amazing storyteller. Many of you may already know that, but I want to do these families justice in this quick spotlights. The McLaughlin story began when Bernard Barney McLaughlin married Alice Kane in Ireland. They had a son, John, in 1849, and the three came to America sometime between 1849 and 1855, when their second son, Bernard Jr., was born in Boston's 7th Ward, the same notorious neighborhood that the Boston Committee on Internal Health condemned as a perfect hive of human beings. Barney Sr. could not read or write and worked as a laborer while his wife Alice kept house. In time, the couple had at least 9 children, some of whom died young. The family never seemed to stay in one place for very long, but moved around from tenement to tenement, first in Ward 7 and later in the North End. Their 9 children were born at 6 different addresses. So by the time they arrived at the Clough house in 1880, it was at least the 7th tenement they had lived at in 25 to 30 years. By this time, 3 of their 9 children had already passed away: Dennis and Alice Jr. as young children, and John of tuberculosis at age 25. The 3 surviving older children had moved out, leaving 3 to live with their parents in the tenement. In the 1880 census, Barney was 54 and still worked as a physical laborer, while Alice, 53, stayed at home. Thomas McLaughlin was 19 and worked as a butcher. His sister Rebecca was 17 and worked as a salesgirl, and Charles, the youngest sibling, was 12 years old and still in school. The McLaughlins only stayed at the Clough house for 4 years before moving on to presumably another tenement. Their story is one of mobility, personal loss, and working hard to make ends meet. The second family that I want to highlight is the Dandaro family. The Dandaro family continued the emerging trend of young couples with children at the property. Giovanni and Candida immigrated from Italy in 1903 with their oldest son, Adolfo. When they came over, Giovanni was 26, Candida was 17, and their son only a newborn. Once in Massachusetts, they had at least 4 more children: Alfredo, Stefano, Enrico, and Louis, although it appears that Alfredo may have died young. The 1910 census shows that they took on a boarder, Enrico Greco, a 34-year-old fruit salesman who emigrated in 1893. Greco lived at the property from 1908 to 1910. The Dandaro family lived in the Clough house from 1909 until at least 1920, a relatively long time for tenants. During this time, Giovanni mainly worked as a laborer doing odd jobs, but by 1920 he had secured a position doing wage labor as a salesman in a market, despite his illiteracy and inability to speak English. Candida kept house and took care of the children, all of whom went to school where they learned English. By 1920, 16-year-old Adolfo, the oldest son, worked part-time as a druggist in a store in addition to attending school, not a small feat for an immigrant teenager. Interestingly, in the later written records, many members of the family had their first names anglicized, Giovanni to John, for example, as had several other Italians in the house. So I wanted to spotlight an Irish family in the earlier years of the tenement experience and an Italian family in the later years of the tenement experience. The 2013 dig found various types of pencils on site, which I just find really fascinating, and it ranged from a slate stylus to a mechanical pencil, demonstrating the changing technology in writing instruments and the dedication to education that many families practice, not just the Dandaros. And now I want to invite you to think about your own homes. I'm curious if any of you know much about your own homes or have done any research. I live in a single family home built in 1910 in West Roxbury, but I only know about the previous 2 families who lived here, and I don't know anything about the first family to live in this home, but I would like to. There's something powerful to me about feeling a connection to people who've experienced the range of human emotions in the same physical space as you. We're going to do another poll here, asking you to reflect on what you know about your own home. And I invite any of you who answered yes to either of these questions to put some comments in the chat box. And if any of you have a brief comment, then TJ's invited to share that. It's interesting that we're almost half and half with conducting research. Or not almost, but it's a little bit closer than knowing how many families. So it's hard because once you go down that route, you realize how much work it actually is. And actually Joe's lecture last week gave some really good tips on how to go about that research. Was there any comments that we should add to our conversation at this time?
Not thus far.
Okay, great. If any of you think of anything that you want to share about what you've discovered about your own home, particularly if you live in a historic home in Boston, that would be great.
Oh, we got a few comments, Aaron.
Okay.
Do you want me to read them off?
Yep, go ahead.
We have one from Lori. My home was built in the 1840s. At one point, the barn was a button factory. We used to find old buttons while playing in the attic.
Oh, cool.
And then one from Joseph. I'm a professional genealogist, so it's kind of like cheating. That's his comment, not mine. I did the research after finding a set of servant stairs behind the kitchen wall.
Ooh, interesting. So with both of these examples, the buttons and the rear stairwell, we're seeing this tangible evidence of a life lived that's different from what we're living right now. And it piqued your interest, it sounds like, to do a little bit more digging. And that's certainly what happened with us, the staff at Old North. This dig in 2013 really opened the door and made us even more curious about this building that we hadn't really put as much thought into until after this dig. So let's move on to talk about the neighborhood. Not just yet. So here, I want you to think about how this one small plot of land, the Clough House, represents the needs, experience, and domestic lives of hundreds of people, while also serving as a microcosm of Boston. As English, Irish, Portuguese, Jewish, and Italian immigrants moved to Boston in massive numbers, living conditions worsened over time, particularly in cheaper neighborhoods like the North End. By 1855, it was the most densely populated neighborhood in Boston. This aerial view is actually from 1925. Overcrowded tenements led to unsanitary conditions for tenants, and serious illnesses like tuberculosis and cholera afflicted the immigrant populations on a large scale. Moreover, many families, like the McLaughlins, moved from one tenement to another, indicating transience and instability that really defined the community here for over a century. So let's take a closer look at this aerial shot. I know the aerial view of the North End very well, and I struggled to find Old North simply because its gleaming white steeple was not as white in this image. Where my cursor is right here, you can see that's Old North. So what I just said was that by 1855, it was the most densely populated neighborhood. So you can imagine by 1925, when this photo was taken, and this is, if you think back to that bar graph, when there were 8 different families living in the Clough House, it was intense, to say the least. There was probably not the open space that we imagine today. The Prado wasn't there, the Paul Revere Mall, none of the little parks that we associate, the happy little gardens that you might find when you're walking around the North End, none of that was there. By 1920, there were 40,000 people crowded in the North End, 4 times the North End's population today. And 97% of the neighborhood was Italian by that time. Again, these are just staggering numbers in my opinion. Oops. Sorry, hold on. So I don't want to paint a completely bleak picture here, just by these numbers and by these images. Although it is really truly difficult for us today to imagine the living conditions of the tenement period. But then I see pictures like this one. This one was taken on Hull Street right in front of Old North in 1920. And we see kids playing in the street, which was actually pretty wide open considering how overly populated the neighborhood was. This was probably why they were playing there. And the scene almost looks quaint to me. If you didn't know what was going on in the rest of the neighborhood, you might think life was much happier. And we know that it was very difficult for them, but the picture also reminds me of the resilience of children and the tight-knit community that the North End was and still is. So it's images like this that help complete the picture, just like Joe Bagley's argument that the artifacts found help tell the story of the families rather than just the poll tax records, because we're seeing how they spent their money, their hard-earned money, what kids they chose to send to school, etc., things like that. And today, as many of you already know, and I know one of you on here lives in the North End, it's still a unique place in Boston, still a huge attraction to people outside of the city and even people living in the city. And it's still continuing to see change from Italian families to younger professionals and young families with kids. Seeing them with their strollers on those narrow sidewalks is always pretty entertaining. But these are people who want to live in an urban core. And so the North End is certainly part of Boston's urban core. So in thinking about the North End, tell us about your neighborhood. And we'll do our third and final poll. What type of neighborhood do you live in? For this one, you can check all that apply, because multiple categories may apply to one particular place of living. Make sure you're reading all the categories, because I have a feeling that many of you who are in urban environments are also in pedestrian locations. Okay, just a few more seconds to weigh in on the poll. All right, let's close it out. So 61%, the majority of you on this webinar define your neighborhood as an urban neighborhood. And what I'm really intrigued by is the percentage of you who live in a historic area, which I guess, considering we're in Boston, is not too surprising, actually. I am surprised that more of you did not select pedestrian, because that just simply means that you do not need a car to have access to what you need in order to live. So there actually are pockets of neighborhoods in Boston where you do need a car and you don't have amenities, but most of the areas in Boston's urban core are pedestrian, and you can get by without ever needing a car, which is pretty exciting. So it's interesting to think about the different places that people live in and how that affects the types of housing in those locations and the types of redevelopment that you end up seeing in those neighborhoods as well. So in the exhibit Still Standing, we wanted visitors to have a creative opportunity. So we invited them to channel their inner Ebenezer and either build a home with Lincoln Logs or to draw their own home and add it to a community neighborhood that we had on the wall. So over here in this corner, you're seeing the neighborhood. So people would be invited to draw here at this table, and they could either build, or if they drew something, then they'd put it in one of these plastic sleeves over here. And we ended up piecing together all of these houses that people drew into neighborhoods. And I just want to share the results with you, because we were, again, pleasantly surprised with people's willingness to participate. their need to do something creative, even if it was not accurate to the home they live in, which you'll see as I progress through. You see a lot of similarities. You know, we have this idea of what a house looks like in our mind that we learn as children. Some you can tell were done by children. But the creativity of some of the people really impressed me, particularly this person who drew their house by floor plan. There's also this cool house here, which was designed with a slide to get downstairs. And this person here is either perhaps imagining where they would like to live or be closer to nature. And then you have this tree house here. So in piecing them all together, we were able to create this, I would say, invented community neighborhood where people from all different walks of life, from all different states, some from different countries, although I think a majority of these people were from the US based on the time frame that we're looking at, US or Canada, because this was up in the fall. It is just really interesting to see. So that is the result of the exhibit. And before we end, I want to talk a little bit about the restoration. So by the 1920s, and in the decades that followed, after centuries of hard use and multiple additions, the Clough House fell into such disrepair that it was deemed a fire hazard, along with several other tenements surrounding Old North. Excuse me. So I want to show you this flyer that, again, I found in our archives. So you can see the shadow of my iPhone taking a picture of it. The Lantern League was a philanthropic membership organization, and they made plans to purchase and demolish these fire menaces in order to save the church, because they felt that their existence compromised the integrity of the church. So over here where my cursor is, that's where the Clough House is located. There used to be buildings behind our gift shop. This is a chapel that is now our gift shop. You can see that there was some where our third lantern garden is, and there used to be some over here that were already removed at this point. So the original idea was to actually knock down the Clough House. And by this point, the Jane Franklin house had already been demolished. So the Clough House fate was pretty tenuous. But thankfully, the National Park Service conducted a Historic American Building Survey, HABS, sometime after 1933. I'm still not quite sure exactly when that survey began. And its architectural and historic importance was established by the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, which is now Historic New England, in 1960. So here, I want to underscore the significance of the Clough House by reading an excerpt from the commission. The Ebenezer Clough House at 21 Unity Street behind Old North Church is probably the most important find in the field of Boston's historical architecture since World War II. A true appraisal of the real worth of the house was given by Thomas T. Waterman, a Boston architect familiar with the house as early as 1927. Waterman called the building one of the most valuable architectural remains of the 18th century, as it gives a singularly complete picture of the house of a city merchant in the beginning of the century. So here are some photographs. I'm going to go through a couple of slides with photographs from the HABS survey. So you can see what kind of state it was in. It's truly in very bad shape. The one thing I like to point out with this one is you're actually seeing the roof line of the Jane Franklin house here. I love this image for that very reason. So you're not only seeing the roof line of the Jane Franklin house, but you're seeing the former roof line of the Clough House itself. Oops. So that was the original hearth in the cellar. It's massive. It's still there. It was not restored. This is the main entrance. So if you walk in that front door, the front door where those men are standing right near it, this is the main entrance. That's the main stairwell. And here is the evidence of all the different units, because these are different electrical boxes. This is the stairwell from the second floor. And this is one of the rooms on the second floor. This is one of the rooms on the second floor as well that faces Unity Street. This is actually Pam Bennett's office today. She's our Director of Retail and Operations. And this is one of the rooms that actually still very much looks like this. Another one of the rooms. And the rear is interesting to look at because this is the physical evidence of the L that was added in 1874, and this was actually ripped off. So during the, or demolished, I should say, during the restoration, they decided to restore it more accurately to its 18th century appearance while keeping the third floor. But they removed this whole structure here because it was not well built. It wasn't built by Ebenezer. So that, when I first looked at this picture, I almost didn't even recognize it as the Clough House because there is no door here today. And this L just really skewed my perspective here. I want to show this before and after. So we have this beautiful interior stairwell, which was well preserved. And the acorn drops here, these acorn droplet detail, we think is a mark of the carpenter. Those can also be found in the Pierce Hitchborn house, which is right next to the Paul Revere house. So I'm thankful that they did such a meticulous job of preserving the interior as well as the exterior. And there is an up-close image of those beautiful acorn droplets shining with their polish. And then here are some of the elevations. Not much to talk about here, but I wanted to at least show you that this HAB survey was quite comprehensive in that they did elevations, they did architectural details. Some of the other drawings actually go into architectural details of the fireplaces and things like the interior. After the HABS report was published, Old North Church embarked on a historic preservation initiative to restore the building, which is detailed in issues of the church's newsletter and other Boston newspapers. Old North really saw it as its duty to preserve this part of Boston's history. So here you can actually see the scaffolding and the restoration is in progress at this time. Here, Old North is announcing to its congregation what's going on and actually asking for donations at the bottom of this. The Christian Science Monitor was also interested and tracked the restoration. This is an old scrapbook that's in our archives, which I'm glad somebody, even though they used obviously a glue that is harsh to the newspaper, I'm glad that somebody did because a lot of the progress of this was much easier to find because it was in the scrapbook in our archives. And then when it was finally completed, you can see in 1972, so it took the better part of a decade. And then the church announces that it's open for meetings. After restoration, the Massachusetts State Federation of Women's Clubs assisted with the upkeep of the space for 40 years. They were actually still helping out, I believe when I first began as an educator. They decorated rooms in period furniture and they held social engagements there. So for that time, the Clough House was actually closed to the public and it was used for private meetings, etc. And then in 2011, the Clough House became a space for historical interpretation at Old North. First, the printing office of Eads and Gill moved in, and then our chocolate shop opened. So you're seeing behind Linda, there are the beautiful hearth that is still preserved and still provides a window into Ebenezer's original vision for the house. And there's another angle looking to the back. So behind those windows there is where the archaeological dig took place. And this is the space that we call Patriots Corner. This would have been on the other side on Unity Street, the other room that faces Unity Street, which we now use for our exhibition space. Today, Clough House stands as a testament to the architectural prowess of Ebenezer Clough, the indomitable spirit of the immigrants working for a better life who lived there, and countless individuals who valued its history and fought to save it from demolition. Old North Church and Historic Site is dedicated to the lasting legacy of this precious structure. So we are absolutely delighted to present this webinar and the exhibit. And I just want to say in conclusion, before we talk about preservation very quickly, the story of the Clough House is the story of the people who've called it home. It's the story of the brick structure itself and its many phases. And it's also the story of the changing community. So this specific tiny building helps us piece together the story of America. So I can't leave you without inviting you to think about why it's important to save historic buildings. So I'm actually curious to what you really think. Now, as we're wrapping up the webinar, write in the chat button or raise your hand if you want to speak. Why? Let's use our critical thinking here. Why does it matter? Now, many of you are on this webinar probably because you're already interested in history. So it's almost a harder question to answer when you're like, well, because it's cool and because history matters. I mean, these are the kinds of questions that come up with my mind, like, well, why not? The stories from this house matters, but we can see that the Jane Franklin house was demolished. Some of it is really luck of the draw. Some of it does depend on what history took place in the structure. But I'm curious what you think. And I'm also wondering if you want to share what buildings in your community have special significance. I'm sure many of you live in either neighborhoods or towns that have saved specific buildings for specific reasons. So if you would like to, share them in the comments. And these are also some organizations that I recommend following if you're interested in historic preservation. The National Trust is the national organization devoted to historic preservation, and the Boston Preservation Alliance and Historic Boston Inc., or HBI, they are local, and we've partnered with them several times. And then also, of course, your local historical societies and historic sites like Old North. I mean, we live in New England, so there is a plethora of historic sites. It feels like you can't throw a rock without hitting some historic home or historic site of importance. So these places also provide you with a connection to the past in a building that means something. So I'm going to stop screen sharing because I can't actually see your faces while I'm doing that. And I'm going to move it back to gallery view. As we close out, let's see. So M. Benoit is our digital marketing associate who's been doing some really awesome work. She actually lives near Old North, and she doesn't know when her building was built. But she did find photos of the original structure, which is cool, which is certainly cool to find because you can, like we did, you can actually track the changes that the building has gone through. So in answering the question of why is it important to save old buildings, Laurie says, because children long for a sense of belonging, and if we don't preserve our history, their history, this is something that we can't offer. So by preserving history and by telling the stories of the people who've lived in these spaces, we're actually creating a connection for the children that come after us. What are some other thoughts? Why is it important? Why was it important to save the Clough House? I obviously have my own thoughts. We're at the end of the webinar now, so feel free to unmute yourself. Mary says, I live now in Charleston, South Carolina, and work part-time at the Hayward, Washington house, where Sarah Grimke also lived as a child. I think the house and all historic houses inspire me and others to be better people through examples of the past. So we can use the experiences, the lived experiences of people from these homes to learn from. That's why we say, you know, history tends to repeat itself, but we should still also learn from our past. The other thing that I mentioned when we were talking about the McLaughlin and the Dandaro families is simply considering the way that people lived in the past and the way that our life today has changed since then gives us a greater perspective for our experience now. That's something that we like our visitors to think about at Old North, is how does this relate to you now and why does it matter? And for me, that's one of the things, is when I think about how hard of a life Candida Dandaro had, it certainly puts life in perspective for me and helps me appreciate how hard people had to work to do the things that we tend to take for granted nowadays. Austin shares that he lives on Prince Street, which is right around the corner from us. And he got involved to save the Nazaro Community Center, which started as a bathhouse for the influx of immigrants. The Nazaro Center has a really interesting history. So it started as a bathhouse for immigrants. And from the start, it gave people a place of community. And that remains to this day, as it will potentially receive landmark status and continue to serve generations of North End residents. That's definitely a success story in the North End. You should also follow Austin on Instagram. Well, I will stick around for a few more minutes. If anybody, oh, no, one more. Okay, yay. Ooh, somebody who was on the dig with Joe. My first on-site dig was the Clough House with Joe Bagley. My maiden name is Hancock, so genealogy and history of the city has been important to me. Joe has opened my eyes to the stories. And the Hancock House, where the State House was torn down and lost a crucial home to the history of our city. The Hancock House was certainly a warning for a lot of other buildings. It was definitely a tragedy and a great loss for our history. And I think that after that, people worked a little bit harder in the preservation community to keep other historic sites that had such a historical importance. One of my ancestors, maybe the Boston Tea Party member, also lived on Prince Street. And actually, I saw the name Roby. So there was actually a Roby who owned Clough House for a while. So I'm actually wondering if there's like.
That's actually why I'm here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, very cool.
I found Andrew Webster's a thesis online late last year, and I read it with fascination because I've been doing research trying to figure out which Joseph Roby, because there were at least two in Boston at the same time in the 1790s and early 1800s, and trying to figure out which Joseph Roby is which.
Yes, it's so difficult. So if you haven't connected with Joe Bagley, you definitely should.
Okay.
Because the lecture from last week, which we did record, we're not going to be releasing it like just on our website. We'll probably release it on particular days or at certain times. But he talks about researching historic homes and the process and what he went through. And it was super helpful and very interesting because there was a lot of things that I would never have thought of. And Joe makes it easy. So, and his book is coming out next spring, which I don't know if he'll actually be detailing the process, because his book is going to be providing snippets of the oldest buildings in Boston. I don't think he'll actually be saying how he did it, which is what he did in this lecture. But if you follow him, I'm sure he's going to be giving this talk as he ramps up promotion for the book. And it's really very helpful for people who are doing their own research right now.
Yeah, I would actually like to read his report. Is there a link to that?
Yeah. Yeah. So for all of you who are on the webinar, thank you for spending your evening with me. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the experience. I'll be sending a follow-up email to all of you probably on Thursday, where I'll include links to additional resources on our website. And then you can read the full report from the 2013 dig. And if you want to see that massive list of artifacts, you can. It's actually on the City of Boston's website. So you can either do a Google search for it, or I'll send you the link on Thursday. So thank you. Like I said, I'll stick around if you have any additional questions about the Clough House or anything else that we're doing with our programming. Otherwise, I'll touch base Thursday, and I hope to see you at another program. Thank you very much.